Hello and welcome to the Monster Mechanics Podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me, as always, is the Doc Brown to my Rick Sanchez, Zach Jaquays. What are we talking about today, Zach?
This week we are talking about the D&D classic Gelatinous Cubes.
Okay, so what is a gelatinous cube, Zach?
So a gelatinous cube is a large 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot cube of basically ooze or slime or goo that dissolves whatever it touches, as long as it's organic material. So you'll have basically just a big cube of Jell-O in your, usually in a dungeon environment, that dissolves anything it bumps into.
And so ostensibly this is a living creature that moves around.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's often been called the Roomba of the dungeon.
The Roomba. Or hey, it predates the Roomba. So wouldn't the Roomba be the gelatinous cube of the home? It's a domesticated one.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a category of creature that is common in fantasy tropes. The ooze, the slime, the pudding. Like this whole idea of like these basically really big single-celled organisms, right? Like these are basically huge amoebas that have been, and in this case with the gelatinous cube, it seems to be like suspiciously well adapted to a world full of 10-foot corridors. Like,
yeah,
because squares don't appear in, I'm not gonna say they don't appear in nature, but like square corridors that a cube would be really good at sliding down are pretty rare in nature. So like what kind of world results in like a creature that has become perfectly adapted to eating all of the organic material in a 10-foot corridor?
Like it's basically the creature just sort of designed for such a dungeon. Like
Yeah. So, but like saying that it was created by a wizard sucks, I think. So I do like the idea that we're talking about a universe that where adventuring parties and 10-foot corridor dungeons are so incredibly common that entire ecosystems have been built up around them. That delights me.
A creature specifically designed for graph paper.
Graph paper. So the answer of the gelatinous cube having come from a voxel based world, like a world where the world really is built on like a 10 by 10 foot or some subset thereof, you know, of a world where you really like when you break open when you dig into the ground, you always create a square cube.
Okay. I mean, I'm already on board for a world where like the basic building blocks of all life and matter are something larger than subatomic. Yeah.
I mean, like, so then we're talking about the weirdness of living in the Minecraft world, right? Like where where you punch a wall until a giant, like a 3 meter squared or cubic area just falls and disappears away. But that still wouldn't explain the presence of dungeons, right? Like what is it that causes the dungeon? Like this weird, like, could the dungeon be an organism?
I'm going to say yes, because absolutely, I think that should be what we discuss.
Okay, so the gelatinous cube in this sense is the pilot fish or the lamprey that is symbiotically or perhaps parasitically inhabiting the body of this dungeon creature, and it's cleaning out the crap that lays within it, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay,
so are the creatures inside a dungeon? Are they a symbiotic creature, or are they like manifestations? Is a young dungeon like something that's like it's just got kobolds and goblins and whatnot, whereas an elderly a mature dungeon is something that has dragons and liches and whatnot living in it.
I think the animals inside it need to be enticed to live there.
Okay,
because then you're playing on Dungeon Keeper rules a little bit, where like the dungeon creature has to have within it things that attract local monsters, and those local monsters act as defense for against adventurers and other like wild creatures and stuff. But then also, no. Here's the question: I think this drives the decision making process between which way we go. Is the monster eating adventurers who come into it, or are adventurers a problem that the dungeon needs solved?
Interesting.
Like, are they the food or are they a predator? Because both are interesting takes.
Because I feel like if the dungeon is a predator that's basically preying on adventurers, which I feel like
it's a giant antlion.
Yeah, that's sort of a classic D&D experience, basically.
Yeah.
Like, and it's basically like maybe internally it generates treasures and whatnot that attract, both adventurers and monsters.
Yeah. Or maybe it doesn't care about adventurers and monsters so much as it just needs things to die within it.
Okay.
It doesn't really, like, it doesn't need adventurers and monsters. It needs things to come inside and fight each other.
Okay.
That's a really esoteric answer, that it like eats conflict.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool.
Or maybe it's like a little after, like it has its own little afterlife that is its digestion. Like it eats souls. Like you have to die within it for your soul to go into its little afterlife.
Okay.
Where then it eats your life essence as long as you die within it.
So how does a dungeon feel about undead creatures?
Maybe those are like, if you come to a dungeon and it's full of undead, those are the ones who died before, who have been consumed by it.
Okay.
So like, and those are like the manifestations of the dungeon itself. Like that's when it's using its own impetus to drive the creatures. But that like, if some kobolds move in, it's perfectly happy to have the kobolds there as long as it can feed off of them.
Okay. So like in this case, like undead creatures is basically like
antibodies.
Yeah, antibodies.
Yeah. Or even like the digestive cells or something like that. Like it's not quite a one-to-one relationship, because like they want to kill the other creatures that come into the dungeon so that the dungeon can eat their life essences and souls.
Whereas the other creatures that sort of migrate into it to take the treasure and whatnot are basically more like beneficial gut bacteria.
Yeah. They're the gut bacteria, and like it's going to digest some of them anyway, but like they get some stuff out of it. Okay, so maybe the dungeons in this world, maybe dungeons are the source of magical items, right? Like, that's always been a weird question I've always had whenever we were playing like a high fantasy D&D game. It's like, who's got the factory full of +1 swords?
Yeah. Who's pumping these out, and like, why aren't these a bigger deal than...
Exactly. And if the idea is that they only ever occur in dungeons, and they only are in the dungeon because the dungeon needs people to come there to look for it, to look for these things. And if the dungeon is sort of otherworldly, like maybe its origin is from beyond this planet or even beyond this plane, then the fact that it's the things that it creates to entice people have special properties makes a lot more sense. These are, of course it's going to make a sword that is unnervingly sharp, is because it comes from a universe where that is possible, and it's bringing a little bit of that weirdness with it.
Yeah. So I also like the idea, like one of the classic tropes of dungeons is that there's always like the end boss creature. And if that was like a function of the dungeon, like maybe either like empowering one of its inhabitants,
the longer that a creature remains in the dungeon, maybe the likelier chance that it sort of like attunes itself with the dungeon creature, and gets empowered by them, perhaps, which makes it bigger and stronger and meaner.
Like in the same way that it's like sort of like enchanting these magic items and whatnot, that get like left by adventurers as they are consumed by the dungeon. Yeah. And converting them into these powerful magic items, like it's doing the same to like the creatures that survive and live long enough in there. Sort of a I'm sort of thinking like a Shadows of Mordor kind of situation where like over time these orcs become more and more powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also enticing adventurers because it's bringing along, it's creating things that lure them in, the magical items, and therefore also basically can act as training opportunities for the creatures that are within it too. Like it's constantly refining and putting those creatures under conflict, from which they learn and develop, or are killed and replaced by other possibly more powerful creatures. So like this is all like a big old churning process here.
Yeah, it's a big old Darwinian experiment.
Yeah. Okay, so we need to delve a little bit into the quote unquote biology of this creature.
Okay.
Is it a little bit like extra dimensional? Like does it really always manifest within a space, or is it maybe a little bit like its own pocket plane?
I feel like it is the space, and like as it grows, it basically like hollows out whatever it exists in.
Okay, so you couldn't have it TARDIS style, where like there's a small hill, and then like you go into it and it's actually a huge complex, or is it like?
I wouldn't be opposed to that, but I wouldn't think it's necessary. Like, because like we've already established that this thing has some weird properties.
Yeah.
Like,
okay.
I feel like that's like one of the many like adaptations that it can sort of like I feel like it's sort of like evolving at a rapid rate. And so like not all of its stuff is going to be functional so much as just, throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. And so like you're going to get a lot of weird stuff as a result of that.
Yeah. Which explains like whenever you go into these dungeons, there's always like weird statues and like random like adornments and things, but like not inconsistently, because almost as if somebody was rolling on a table to determine what was in every room. But it's really just like the evolutionary meanderings, the mutation rate of this the dungeon creature. So if this dungeon creature is what's the word for it? Like, is it a single entity or is it like a colony? Like, is each room a separate entity?
I was thinking like the rooms are basically like organs of the creature, like
okay,
like or like like how like cows have like multiple stomachs or
okay,
or like gizzards for birds, that kind of thing.
Okay, I do like the idea that maybe it can reconfigure itself occasionally.
Oh yeah,
like
I'm picturing it almost like doing this constantly and like like just kind of like growing as it grows, like it just goes down into the earth, so you get like your classic multi-level dungeon.
Yeah, but like the first room isn't always the same. Like if you walked into it, it wouldn't. You would sometimes walk into it and it would be like, oh, this is a 10 by 10 foot room with a orc and a chest. And then you like leave and you've cleared the dungeon or whatever, and you come back and then like now this one's like, hey, it's got a table in here now, and there's also a fireplace, and there's no like the place where the chest was is gone now, because it's like in the intervening weeks since you were last here, the dungeon has grown a little bit and has like moved things around and tried a new configuration.
I feel like it probably changes it like every time a room quote unquote fails.
Okay. So what's the criteria for it failing then?
It not killing something.
Oh, okay. So every time you clear a room without anything dying, it's like, oh, that, man. I need to get like a thing in here. Man, that really does explain all of the traps too, doesn't it? Like these are like specialized internal organs that are like when the dungeon's like, screw it, I'll do it myself.
It's basically the meta teeth of the dungeon.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if like it needs to have a specialized adaptation in order to make itself known to the local community. Like, does it send an organ or like a manifestation of itself that looks like a wizened old man in a robe who like finds the nearest tavern?
Maybe the tavern is a part of the dungeon.
Ooh,
because that's classic. Like you meet at a tavern.
Yeah, the only problem is that like it's not connected to the dungeon in that way.
I mean, not physically.
Not physically. But like
we've already established that dungeons are weird.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe like, to me it sounds like the dungeon is, or the tavern is almost a separate symbiotic organism or something.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe it's got its own goals or something like that. Like did you read Moving Pictures?
It doesn't sound familiar.
It's a Terry Pratchett book. It's the one about the movies, about cinema.
Yeah, I don't think I've read that one.
Okay. I think it's in Moving Pictures, but one of the concepts from that book is the idea that when you have like, I forget what it was, it's like leftover creativity or something like that, it can condense into malls. Like literally a shopping mall just condenses out of nowhere, and there's like, it goes through stages where like first it's all snow globes, and then there's shopping carts, and then there's malls, and like these wizards wander into a mall and there's like Orange Julius and stuff there. Like I wonder if there's a whole collection of species which are buildings that inhibit or entice people to inhabit them for various purposes.
Interesting.
And so like maybe the tavern is a different species, but it fulfills a similar sort of, like it's got an ecological niche that is sort of abuts against the dungeon creature. Well, so like the dungeon is eating people's souls or something like that, right? Maybe the tavern is more like a what's the word? Instead of like being a predator, it's more of a parasite, but it's not one of the ones that kills creatures. Like it allows people to come in and feeds off of them a little bit, and like entices them to stay by producing booze and good times and stuff.
What if it feeds off of stories?
Ooh.
Like, so that's why like you're always finding like bards and taverns.
Yeah.
And like adventurers are there regaling people with the tales of their exploits. And like to stimulate that, it's, sort of form this bond with the dungeons.
and explains why it likes booze, because booze is good for getting people talking and getting their inhibitions down and stuff. That's cool. Okay, so well, let's get back to, we're already like 2 levels off from where we started, which was the gelatinous cube. So let's back up at least 1 and get back to our dungeon friend.
That's how you know it's a good episode.
Where we spend more time on the rabbit hole that we found ourselves in than like the actual creatures that we're supposed to be talking about.
Yeah. So guys, this is an episode about gelatinous cubes.
Yep, that's what we're going to put on the episode title, at least. We'll get back to them. We'll get back to the gelatinous cubes, because we're going to have to talk about the symbiotic creatures. Okay, so it's meant we've talked about this, our extra planar dungeon creature, which is sort of nice. We have to talk a little bit about reproduction, right?
Okay.
Because how do you get new ones? Like, how do you get a new dungeon? Like,
when a mommy dungeon and a daddy dungeon love each other very much.
I think they've got a bud, right? Like, they've got to have some sort of asexual, like, reproduction thing where, like, oh, no. Okay.
All right.
The very powerful magical item you find at the bottom of the dungeon is an egg.
Okay.
A seed. And so this is sort of a long...
So the MacGuffin is...
Yeah.
The dungeon MacGuffin is an egg.
Right. Or I'm thinking seed maybe is a better... Seed or eggs are kind of the same sort of thing.
Sure, yeah.
But, like, you get down there and you kill the end boss, the one that has been empowered mostly by the dungeon. And then by doing so, you've proven that you are a capable adventurer who is probably going to move far afield. You're not just some farmer who's going to, like, take this thing home. So, like, the dungeon, like, gives you a folding boat or something like that. I don't know. whatever is at the bottom of this thing. It's golden chalice or something. And you take that out of the dungeon and then it waits for you to die, right? Like, you have this thing on your possession and then you're out in the world, hopefully not in another dungeon, or possibly in a naturally created cavern or something that would be a conducive environment for this dungeon seed to take off. And you are killed by a cloaker or something. And now the chalice falls into the ground, and the chalice is like, oh, this is a perfect place for me to lay down some roots. And from that seed, like, it breaks open, and from that seed, a new dungeon is born.
Interesting.
And that explains a little bit why, like, because if you're a dungeon and you eat adventurers, then, like, it is really in your best interest to always kill every adventurer that comes into you, right?
Sure, yeah.
But, like, adventurers get out all the time, right? Like, otherwise there wouldn't be, so many of them in taverns all the time, And so the idea that the adventurers are also part of the reproduction cycle is interesting to me. It actually has a real world biological counterpart. Certain carnivorous plants, like pitcher plants and Venus flytraps and such, have to use the very insects they feed upon sometimes to pollinate.
Okay.
And so you will actually there's various different, like, strategies of this, but the one I love is, I think it's the pitcher plant. It makes its pitchers, and then when it needs to pollinate, it sends like one branch off way away from the rest of the plant and puts a flower right at the end of it. And it's like, okay, bugs, this one's safe. And they go and they, like, get their pollen and stuff, and they cover themselves with pollen, and then they fly off to the next one and they pollinate. And it's like, you have to come up with, like, a specialized adaptation in order to not eat everything that you need also to reproduce. And so maybe the dungeons have something sort of like that, where, like, you are sort of allowed to get to the bottom of the dungeon and get one of these seeds so that you can inadvertently carry it off.
Interesting.
The other option, instead of the MacGuffin, the other option is, of course, is the goblin that every adventuring party adopts.
Oh, God. Good old Boblin the Goblin.
Because that would explain why so many adventure parties are like, hey, you random goblin, you are now one of ours.
and the real reason is because it's the first NPC that the DM has tried giving any kind of unique voice to.
Yeah, often.
And usually they make it sniveling and pathetic.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, now I'm just going to feel bad killing this. So it's coming with us.
Now I have to act like a human. So I have to actually act like a person and not kill everything I see.
On the plus side, like, this is usually the moment where some parties realize that they can be more than murder hobos.
That is true. Yeah. And then sometimes you, as a DM, you purposefully design something for the people to, Like here's an NPC that just it's meant for you guys to do this with. I can't remember if that was just an NPC or if it was a magical item. The tortoise of holding.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
Tortoise of holding, which was like I think 8 feet wide or something like that. It was this great big stone tortoise, and it was a magical item because anybody who carried this pouch, it was the pouch of ever lettuce. And you could pull as much lettuce out of it as you wanted, and it was to feed the tortoise. And then you could lift up one of the scutes on the tortoise's shell, and inside of it was a bag of holding, basically. But the best part about it was that it would make its way through spaces too small for it to fit through, but only if nobody was watching, because it was shy.
Yeah. Good
okay.
times.
Yet another digression. Okay. So is this a world where every dungeon that ever exists is just a manifestation of one of these creatures? Or is it like,
I feel like the in most cases, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I have a question though.
Sure. Yeah.
What's mortality like for these dungeons?
How do they die is a really good question, because they can't be died when they're cleared out, right?
So what is a dead dungeon?
So when you go through a dungeon and then you get to the end and you grab the MacGuffin, and then for some reason the temple collapses, or like the whole world starts to implode on itself. I think that's got to be the dungeon itself dying, right? And like you have to then have the amazing race right out,
Okay, yeah.
And so maybe it literally is like the number of times it gets cleared or something like that, where like over time, the more people who clear it, the closer it gets, because it's having to produce more and more of those magical items. And that taps into some finite resource somewhere.
So like the number of clears is sort of like the rings on a tree, kind of.
Yeah. Or maybe it's a death to clear ratio. Like if it TPKs like 15 adventuring parties and then one comes through and clears it like knocks off some magical energy to reform all of its loot, basically.
Yeah.
But then, if it continues to be a successful dungeon and killing lots of things that come into it, then it regains that energy from the creatures that it is ingesting. And so it's not like, okay, I've got 5 clears in me and then I'm dead. It's more like I need to kill enough adventurers to make sure that like I can maintain my energy while also allowing enough of them to clear the dungeon so that I can then reproduce. So it's like this ratio balance thing. And sometimes they get it off, and sometimes, they're not able to keep up with the times and they get cleared too many times and they die,
Yeah.
That's interesting.
They introduce a new overpowered D&D class, and that just keeps clearing the dungeon.
Or and similarly, like if it is a dungeon that is really good at clearing or really good at killing adventurers, it TPKs everything that comes inside. It gets really powerful because it gets lots and lots of energy from these creatures, from the people trying to take it down, which it's able to kill all of them, but it never gets to reproduce, like because they never clear it to grab the MacGuffin and like allow its egg to go somewhere else. So it really does have to maintain that balance between the two, otherwise it won't. Yeah,
it won't proliferate.
Yeah. Okay.
So dungeon.
So we've got the gelatinous cube, which is obviously just like, this is a slime, right? Like this was just a really big amoeba that, because these dungeons seem to really like 10 foot by 10 foot corridors, it has just maximized its available or its mass to be able to fit through all of these things and clear them out of the biological material. Because the dungeon's totally cool with this because it doesn't actually eat the biological material; it just like consumes the life energy.
Yeah.
And so therefore, like the gelatinous cube is just a useful creature to have. It's got bacteria, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
Are there any other like really specialized monsters that like live within, like they seek out dungeons like that?
Mimics.
Oh yeah, mimics. Yeah. They get by the gelatinous cube by imitating inanimate objects.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're basically they're trying to snipe the kill, basically, right? Like they're trying to get some of that good juice energy out of the adventuring party.
So are mimics like sort of like micro dungeons, I guess? Maybe
they could be. Maybe and that could be a different angle for if you want to have like
or maybe they're just like lice for dungeons.
I think they're like I think my interpretation would be that they're lice or something living like a worse kind of parasite, like a tapeworm. They're a tapeworm because they live in the stomach and they try to eat the food before the dungeon can eat the food.
Okay, yeah.
And so like it would be in the dungeon's best interest to get rid of these things, but it maybe doesn't have a great mechanism for it, you know? So yeah, they're a little parasite. That's
like,
good.
well, it's something that's adapted to like hiding from its particular antibodies.
Yeah, because it's got,
or even preying on its antibodies.
Yeah. It's like, it's a particularly well adapted creature like that. So we can, I don't think we need to do too much guessing about what a society that was living in a world filled with these dungeons would look like, because it's every adventure, it's every murder hobo heavy D&D game you've ever played in, right? Like,
yeah, it's literally like half the population is adventurers kind of set up.
Yeah.
Like a gold costs 50 gold pieces because of inflation, or sorry, a beer costs 50 gold pieces because of inflation.
Yeah, because the dungeons just create gold. They're just like, whatever. And gold's an otherwise pretty useless metal.
Yeah, it's why the currency is gold instead of something like, some sort of alloy.
Yeah. Do I have a complete digression, which isn't even on topic at all, but it's just about how useless gold is. There's actually something that gold would be particularly useful for if it was more common, which is bullets.
Interesting.
I was just thinking about this because I write a sci-fi audio drama, and I was thinking about bullets in space, and I was like, oh, gold is actually super common in space compared to some other metals, and it is heavier than lead and is more ductile than lead, so therefore it makes a better bullet, specifically a hollow point style bullet that would fragment on impact, and therefore would be more likely to be safe to fire against the hull of a ship without puncturing the air pocket.
Interesting.
So, which you would not want to do if you were, say, inside of the ships. You might want to have munitions that you could fire at a hull plate and it would just shatter. And gold would actually be better at that job than lead would.
Interesting. James Bond wants to know your location.
How badass is the golden bullets, right? Like that's just like really cool imagery, right? Anyway, sorry, that was a complete digression, but this whole episode's digressions, so I don't feel guilty even a little bit.
Rabbit hole the episode.
We're still going to call it Gelatinous Cubes. Okay, does that mean any of the other slimes and oozes and stuff like that, are they similar like organelles?
I figure, yeah. Like, I mean, like they all sort of serve the same function, like the green slime, the black pudding,
Yeah. They just eat things.
Yeah.
Could there be ones that do something more specialized, like the internal structuring of the dungeon? Like it's able to create new rooms, but maybe like the surface features of those rooms are actually like erosions or like things laid down by slimes or sub-organs or something like that.
Interesting.
Like I can imagine like a slime that looks, like it's like a mud or something like that. Like it's a thing that looks like it's made out of sand and dirt and stuff. And like as it's moving through the dungeon, it's like laying down a new floor, and like changing the surface texture or something like that.
Okay.
Or
so it's sort of responsible for like the aesthetic changes to a.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking like it's a specialized, like it's an organelle. It's like it's a part of the dungeon creature that is like making these changes. It's just like the mechanism by which those changes are made is this small ooze or something like that.
Sort of like the representation of like the DNA for eye color in a person or something.
Yeah. And these are sort of and which is why you see them in a lot of dungeons, but you don't see them a lot because most of the time the dungeon's trying to keep you out of the way because it doesn't really want you to kill like part of itself. It wants you to kill the hobgoblins that have moved in specifically for it, So, okay, actually that's a good question. How does it get the hobgoblins to move in? Because like it gets the adventurers in with the magical items, but
I mean, that's got to be like attractive to the hobgoblins and whatnot too, right?
Oh, the magical items?
Yeah.
But then they would use the magical items. And that's always the problem in dungeons is that you get in there and the +1 sword is always in a box at the base of the dungeon. And like
instead of being wielded by
you'd think a hobgoblin would grab that shit.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be an answer, but then why stay? Like if the hobgoblins want the sword, why not go in, get the sword, and then just leave?
Well, I mean, if this dungeon is constantly producing treasure.
Oh, so they're like farming it. They've taken a whole different and
like this is sort of like their agriculture in a way. Like they're just farming up these boxes of gold or whatever. Maybe like the reason they don't use it is sort of like a form of like toxoplasmosis from the dungeon that like convinces them not to use the items.
Ooh, the idea that every monster inside of a dungeon has like a little slime in its head that has like toxoplasmosis its way into its cerebral cortex and is like kind of controlling it a little bit is super creepy, and I like it.
Yeah, and I like that. Like that's why like the the monsters like always sort of like leap to defend the dungeon to the death instead of
they don't run away.
Instead of like bargaining with the adventurers or, trying to bribe them
because
off.
they've been cordycepsed into believing that they have to, because the dungeon is using them as a defense mechanism and really just eating them.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Although why doesn't the dungeon just have like the hobgoblins kill each other?
Because then they wouldn't, because if nobody ever leaves, then it can't reproduce.
Gotcha.
Because it needs somebody to take away the MacGuffin.
Right.
And as a side benefit, if once you get past like level 1 dungeon, once you're like a level 2 or 3 dungeon and you kill like level 2 or 3 parties, they've usually got some magical items with them, which then become part of the loot for the dungeon. And you didn't have to spend your energy making those. So they're free.
Do you think there's any like going back to like that reproduction thing, like, do you think like the cross-pollination of like magic items from one dungeon to another by adventurers plays into that?
Maybe that's their sex.
Yeah.
Gross.
Gross, but I love it.
That's how they exchange DNA. Is they load some of it into their magical items, and then if it gets brought into another dungeon and the magical adventuring party dies there, then it gets added to that dungeon. Or similarly, if you have multiple magical items from a dungeon, from different dungeons, because you've been you're level 15 or whatever that, and you've got a ton of them, and then you die in a place that isn't the dungeon and it starts to form a new dungeon there. It's a mixture of all of the various dungeons that you've been to that is created there. That's rad. I actually like that a lot.
But by that means, like, if a dungeon like is being farmed by these adventurers, like, wouldn't that infer that like that dungeon is weaker somehow? Or
well, yeah, we said if they're able to go in and take all of its magical items over and over again, they're going to kill it off.
Yeah.
So you can't like sit there and farm a dungeon because it needs other people to die in it in order to live. So yeah, it is weak, and it will only produce so many of the items, before, and then you have to give those up in order to make a new one. So yeah, it's actually a way for it to die, for weak dungeons to die off, is by being cleared too many times.
Okay.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's a balancing point. Like, it's not a perfect system on either side, because go too far in either direction, and either you don't reproduce by letting magical items escape your dungeon, or you are cleared too many times and you die off and you can't produce new ones.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think if I was if we're using this as the basis in order to create a world, one thing that also is true is that there are so many more useless magical items.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Like, there's like mugs that are +1 to hit, and like and like things that, like, because the dungeon doesn't know really what's useful exactly, so it like mutates and tries things a little bit more, and like you get weird things, instead of a drinking pouch that produces liquid, it's like it's a thimble or something like that, where it's like it doesn't really work,
This is my dagger of never-ending water.
Yeah. A colander of never-ending water. It's just like dripping all of the time.
This is where the turtle of holding came from.
Yeah. And also the ever-writing pen that even writes on the air.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I really love the idea of a dungeon as a living thing. I feel like that explains a lot about, like, basically just D&D gamification as, as a whole.
Oh man, what about okay, so we go late stage with this whole idea where, like, this universe has grown up this way, that like magical items are constantly being introduced. And then you get very late in the game, once somebody has figured all of this out, you have the guy who is farming dungeons. And when I say farming dungeons, it's not like going in and clearing them. I mean, like, he is crafting new dungeons and planting them places in order to create new dungeons in useful locations for him to then send adventurers to, and like not farming, fancying, like he's a pigeon fancier, but for dungeons.
just dungeon husbandry.
Yeah, dungeon husbandry is perfect. And like, so like you have guys who like specifically are crafting the dungeons. Like, almost every GM eventually gets to the idea of adventurers as a sporting event. Like the guys who are like, it's a public sporting event. We're going to have like cameras or whatever, and everybody's going to watch it at the stadium or whatnot. And like, this is that version where like now they are hand rearing dungeons to send people into, and they even occasionally have to like make sure they send in people who will die and re-add their to feed the dungeon, that explains the yawning portal in Waterdeep, which is like on top of Undermountain. Yeah, Undermountain. And it's like,
yeah.
Instead of being just some random thing that happens to be there, it's like, no, this is the economy of our city is based on people coming in and doing this shit.
Yeah. Hallister was all about, like, he figured this shit out, and he was like, hell yeah, I'm gonna make the ultimate dungeon.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna make bank on this.
And it worked. Okay. Well, let's take a couple of listener questions and then call it a day.
All right.
So another one from Grays at _ Grays, excuse me. If humans lived in a world with monsters, we would surely have domesticated some of them. I mean, like cats, not cows. What would be the best pet monster?
Ooh.
So, I mean, we've got to rule out all of the sentient ones, right? Like, we're not going to have a pet werewolf. Somebody will, because there's sex stuff going on there and people are freaks. There will be that, but like, that's not really what we're talking about. A shape-shifting pet of some sort, like a mimic, might be actually pretty cool because that'd be quite useful. And that's all, if you can properly train it to turn into useful stuff, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, like, we've all had like that misbehaving dog that just like, it never figures out the tricks that you're trying to teach it. And so you're like, all right, chest. And like, it just turns into a footstool. And you're like, oh, you're a good mimic anyways.
As somebody who owns a very stupid dog who doesn't know many tricks, I do heavily relate to that. Yeah. What else? You got any ideas? Domesticated.
I got, like, as far as just like cute monsters, like, because there's some, like, there's the useful monsters, and then there's, ones that you just want because you're like, I'm gonna make that a pet,
whichever sounds good to you.
And really, I've just been stalling because my mind is drawing blanks. Like, if we're ruling out like sentient monsters, that rules out a lot. But like,
so I mean, I have been a long time proponent of the squonk, but I think that might be a very difficult creature to domesticate for some various reasons. For those of you who don't remember, the squonk is a very wrinkly creature that is incredibly ashamed of its appearance, and if ever seen, will apologize and then dissolve into a puddle of tears until you go away because it is so ashamed of itself. The axe-head hound maybe is also a good option for that one because that's explicitly a dog. I mean, who wouldn't want a Cerberus, right? Like a giant 3-headed dog that just is a dog, right?
That's three dogs in one.
Yeah. That's like 3. And like, but only still one butthole. So you get 3 times as many ears to scratch and 3 times as many tongues that will be licking you, and only a single amount of poop to be cleaning up. Although Cerberus is supposed to be pretty large. So maybe I guess it's a really big poops, but what else is there? There's a lot of birds. I mean, a pet rock would be very useful.
I mean, as long as you don't have to feed it.
Yeah, I mean, like that's true. I mean,
but I mean, there's always the pet rock joke. So I mean,
yeah, that's good. Yeah. Griffin for smaller.
Yeah.
I mean, that is large apex predators would be very expensive to feed.
I feel like the mogwai is probably there's a movie about why that's a bad idea.
Yeah. Although those are very obviously sentient too. See, I just keep looking at dogs. I just like dogs. I'd be like axe handle hound, Cerberus, Fenrir.
I mean, Displacer Beast. There's a good one.
Okay. Yeah.
If you're more of a cat person, or
so
cat adjacent.
Grays specifically said dogs, not cows, but like there's got to be some good like livestock in here too. Like, okay. You poo-pooed my rock, but like think how big the chicken nuggets off a rock are, right? Like that is a lot of meat.
Yeah.
Although actually apex predators are not great for food. They tend to be one of the things that is unfortunate is that things like heavy metals tend to move up the food chain. And so like eating long-term like meat from meat eaters is not good for your health. It also tends to taste bad apparently. Although
you could always have a pet Tarrasque just for that.
Yeah, that's true. There's got to be some magical goats that would be good too, for like livestock. Because goats are famously like you can shear them for wool. You can milk them for what's the word? Milk. We've been at this a little while. I'm a little bit loopy. Okay. Yeah. Well, there's our answer. I say any kind of magical dog, and
sure, you have blink dogs.
Yeah. Zach says Displacer Beast, which is just a cat. We just go back to cats and dogs because they are pets.
I mean, we blew all our creativity on the dungeon. So
yeah, maybe. Well, okay, let's look at, we have a couple more other questions here. Another one from friend of the show, Richard Kreutz Landry, or at R. Kreutz Landry. You've done plenty of hive minds. What would be a mind hive? So this has got, I mean, a hive of minds has got to be a like illithid version of a bee colony.
Okay,
like,
yeah.
Is this something created by an illithid apiarist? Like makes these little brain bees, I guess.
Brain bees just sounds like you're cutifying it. Like these little brain bee. Brain
bees.
Yeah, it has been a long day, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's an illithid who's made a bunch of little brain bees and has made them into a big brain hive. Or possibly the reverse of, I mean, so linguistically, the hive mind is a bunch of bodies with a single intelligence spread amongst them. Mm-hmm. But you could also have the mind hive be a single creature that has lots of intelligences within it.
Yeah.
Actually, a monster, some sort of ethereal creature that maybe like absorbs your intelligence into itself and like you then become part of it would be a pretty good horror monster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could also have a mind hive be like when you encounter just an utterly repellent idea and your brain just reacts to it allergically.
Mind hives.
Yeah.
I like it. Yes. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Well, there's a couple of listener questions. As always, if you would like to ask us a question about, monster related things or pretty much anything, you can hit us on Twitter. We are at MonsterMPod.
All right.
And with that, we'll see you guys again in 2 weeks.
Until next time.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Monster Mechanics. If you'd like to reach us to send in your listener questions or just give us any kind of feedback, you can, of course, hit us on Twitter. Like I said before, it's MonsterMPod. Or if you'd like to email us, if that's like your thing, you're old school like that, then monstermechanicspodcast@gmail.com will also get to us. You would be the first person to ever send us an email that wasn't spam. So get on it. And now for the credits. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by me, Scott Paladin, and hosted by myself and my best friend, Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas produced during this podcast are released under a do what the you want public license.